This first module, among other things, looks at theories of literacy development. This week our focus is on bottom-up theory and the skills model. You'll see here that I've set out 5 learning intentions for this presentation. Learning intentions are things that teachers typically share with students at the start of lessons today, and they do this so students have a clear understanding of what the purpose of the lesson that the teacher's delivering is, so why it's important that they learn about whatever the topic is. And then there are success criteria that are also provided so students can self-assess against the success criteria and gauge whether or not they've been successful in achieving the learning intentions for the lesson. Teachers can also use the success criteria and the feedback they get from students' progress throughout and at the end of lessons, and they can use this to inform future lessons and how they differentiate the next lesson. What I mean by this is some students will have the same lesson revisited and concepts revisited, but perhaps in a different way. So students who haven't quite grasped what they were intended to learn have more time to do so, and those who were successful can be extended and moved on to the next particular teaching and learning focus. So one of the things that I wanted to clarify first of all was, what's the difference between a theory and a model? And I offer you this information because if I reflect back to when I did my first teaching degree, I recall being in lectures and having absolutely no understanding of what the lecturer was talking about when they discussed different theories and so forth. It wasn't until years later, when I'd been working in schools for some time and therefore had that practical understanding based on experience, that I had my light bulb moment, and suddenly these theoretical discussions that the teacher was trying to teach me actually started to make sense. So essentially, theories are ways of explaining things that we don't understand in the absence of facts. In education, we don't actually know how children learn. We don't actually know how students acquire language, nor do we know as fact how children become literate. So in the absence of such facts, experts have developed theories that attempt to explain these things. So this week we're looking at theories of literacy development. So these are different theories that exist to explain how children become literate. And you'll see as you learn about the different theories how they might be teaching the same sorts of skills to a certain extent, but the theoretical understanding of how these skills are acquired differs. In order to put a theory into practice, teachers need models, and models are essentially ways of showing or representing theories so that it can be applied in practice. Going back to our focus for this week, the theory that we're looking at is bottom-up theory, and the model that teachers can use to show and apply bottom-up theory is the skills-based model. Assessment 1 requires you to write a 1,500-word persuasive essay that addresses the following topic. What is the most relevant reading model for addressing 21st century literacy demands? You'll notice that the word model is asterisked, and I've also underlined it just to show its significance. So while this week there's a lot of reference to bottom-up theory, if you decide that what you've learnt about in week 1 is above what you'll learn about in future, that this week makes the most sense in terms of the best way to teach children how to read, then you would argue not for the bottom-up theory, but for the skills model. I emphasise this because in previous teaching periods, those students who were unsuccessful at passing Assessment 1 frequently didn't pass because they'd argued for a particular theory rather than a particular model. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, the learning materials will build your understanding of 3 models in particular. These are the skills model, the whole language model, and the 4 resources model. In addition to this, Chapter 4 of your e-text also discusses 2 other models for teaching reading, and these include the transactional model and the Halliday Plus model. So in total, you've got 5 different models that can be used to teach reading. Every single one of these models has both benefits and limitations. It's up to you, when you've worked your way through the learning materials and read Chapter 4 in detail and done additional research beyond Chapter 4 on these particular models, it's up to you to decide which one you think is the best for addressing 21st century literacy demands. There is no right or wrong answer here, so I want to put that out there for now. I don't have a preference. It's up to you to decide which you think is the most relevant for addressing those 21st century literacy demands. Another point I wanted to clarify here is that this week's learning materials invited you to look at Chapter 1 of the e-text as well, and here you would have read about different models of schooling. So for example, the industrial model of schooling is discussed, as is the inquiry model, etc. Note that for Assessment 1, you're not looking at one of these models of schooling. You're looking at one of the models of literacy development, such as the skills model or any of the other 4 models that I've listed on the previous slide. The difference between models in schooling and models of literacy development is models of schooling are much more broad and they can be applied in any curriculum or subject area, so they're not specific just to English. Models of literacy development, on the other hand, pertain to how children become literate, so how they develop the skills necessary to read and to write. If you think about the industrial model as a general broad model of schooling, picture a very traditional classroom. You might see seating set out in rows and children typically seated in isolation of each other. They are not encouraged to work together, to collaborate, to discuss their learning. Rather, learning is quite an individual experience. You've got the teacher probably working from the front of the room, directly instructing children from the board, and everybody is delivered the same thing at the same time in the same way. So there's little emphasis on differentiating instruction or paying attention to children's individual needs or interests. The skills model is a way of reflecting the industrial model, but in the context of reading. So this is where the skills of reading are taught in isolation, and as per bottom-up theory, which the skills model represents, reading is taught beginning with the smallest or the simplest skills, and these are gradually and sequentially built on, so that by the time a child becomes an independent reader, they've been taught in a linear way all of the different skills that a child uses in order to read successfully. Again, reflecting on my own experience as a student at university, if someone had asked me, particularly at the start of my teaching degree, how you teach a child how to read, I wouldn't have really had much to say. So I thought I'd share a couple of images on this and the next slide, which show you the sorts of skills that teachers teach when helping children to learn to read. And you can see from this particular image that this is representative of the bottom-up theory. So this image starts from print concepts on the bottom left and gradually builds in a systematic way to develop skills in phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary and comprehension. So starting with the smallest skills and gradually and sequentially building up to the most complex skills, which is comprehension. So whilst the end product of bottom-up theory and the end goal of bottom-up theory is for a child to be able to read accurately, fluently and with comprehension, comprehension is the end goal and not the starting goal. So this particular graphic builds on those 5 broader skills and explains them in more detail. So pause this particular slide and take the time to read what's contained in each of the boxes, and this will give you an explanation of the sorts of skills that teachers are teaching when teaching children how to read and following the skills model, so applying bottom-up theory in the skills model. Just to briefly explain what they mean, print concepts is a child's awareness of a text, and children who are read to early on in their lives will come to school with a natural awareness of print. They'll understand where a book begins and ends. They may understand that the text in the book creates meaning. They wouldn't be able to read necessarily, but they would understand that the text flows from left to right and from top to bottom, and they'll know things like the images within a text complement the meaning of the written word. Beyond this, children are introduced to phonological awareness. Now, this isn't shown in the graphic, but I wanted to touch on it. Phonological awareness is an essential step that precedes trying to teach children how to read. Oral language is the foundation of all learning. So children need to understand and have a broad vocabulary. Vocabulary comes from reading, essentially, and this is because the language within text is much more complex than the language that we would typically use in conversation. This is why children who are read to as preschoolers are far more prepared to learn when they arrive at school, because as a result of that exposure to books, they've got a much broader vocabulary than those who haven't been read to. Everything we know and understand in our lives is expressed through words. So the broader our vocabulary, the easier it is to learn and to express our understanding. Further to this, there's a strong correlation between the amount of time spent reading and a child's academic success. So it doesn't matter what age a child is, I would strongly urge you to ensure and encourage that children are reading on a daily basis, and that parents have an understanding of the importance of reading. The more a child reads, the better their chances of academic success are, and this is a proven fact. Going back to the term I mentioned earlier, phonological awareness. So phonological awareness is a child's ability to hear the sounds in spoken language. This is why children in kindergarten and even pre-kindergarten are exposed to and get so much pleasure from things such as nursery rhymes. They hear the rhyming patterns. They can come up with their own silly rhymes. They can clap the syllables within words. They might be able to hear and identify the initial sound in a word or the final sound in words and so forth. Phonological awareness has to be present in order to then introduce our system of phonics and the alphabet. The alphabetic system introduces children to the 26 letters of the alphabet and their corresponding sounds. Phonemic awareness is understanding that letters or the sounds within our speech can be represented by symbols in printed text. There are 26 letters in the alphabet. There are 44 phonemes in our language, and phonemes are our sounds of speech. So what this means is that while children might be taught the alphabet, and they might be taught things like A makes A, B makes B, C makes K, that there are actually other sounds that the alphabet itself doesn't represent, and it's also teaching them that the alphabet sounds themselves can actually represent different sounds. The alphabet letters themselves can represent different sounds. What I mean by this is A as a letter can represent A as a sound, or A as a sound, or A as a sound, etc. It's understanding that letters come together to represent sounds. So for example, a C and an H makes a ch sound. This is a phoneme of our language. It's also understanding that the same sound can be spelt in multiple ways. So for example, F as in frog is represented by an F letter, but F as in phone is represented by the PH combination of letters. So this is what's shown and elaborated on in that orange and yellow section, and these are the sorts of things that are typically taught as part of a systematic phonics program. Phonics programs are typically seen in skills model, and this is a systematic way of teaching all of the things that I've just described. It might include programs such as Jolly Phonics or Soundway or Sound Waves, just to name a few. And essentially, schools and teachers that implement phonics programs would get a set of student resources and a teacher resource which guides the teacher to implement lessons in a particular way, in a particular sequence, to the whole class and so forth. Further to this is fluency. So in order for a child to comprehend, they need to be able to read words automatically. So whilst phonics looks at breaking words down into individual sounds, which is something we call decoding. So the word cat, decode it, at. So by segmenting that word into its individual sounds and then blending it into blending those sounds all together, children are able to read the word as a whole. And once they've done that multiple times, they probably will be able to recognise the word as a sight word. Once a children has a broad sight vocabulary and can read words automatically, then they've achieved fluency, and fluency is an essential step for comprehension. Comprehension itself includes lots of different skills, such as being able to make personal connections, such as being able to ask questions to clarify their understanding, to identify when they've lost meaning and to be able to do something about it, such as using the grammar of the sentence to be able to predict what might make sense, and so forth. On the previous slide, I mentioned a couple of commercial phonics programs. This video looks at another one, and the purpose is not to promote the phonics program, but give you a context to analyse a typical bottom-up theory classroom where a skills model such as a prescribed phonics program is being implemented. So have a look at the video and consider the video in relation to the dot points listed below. The final point I want to make is to emphasise the importance of you understanding what 21st century literacy skills are now. The reason I emphasise this is that the essay question requires you to argue the best model for teaching reading and preparing students for 21st century literacy demands. In order to answer the essay question properly, you need to explain what these 21st century literacy demands are and go back to this in each of your arguments. I suggest you do 3 things to clarify your understanding of 21st century literacy skills. The first is to use your e-text and read about the 6 guiding principles for teaching reading and writing in the 21st century. Make some notes on these principles and be clear about them in your own mind. Then reflect on these principles in relation to what you've learnt about this week and the skills model. So to what extent does the skills model meet these guiding principles, and to what extent, if any, does the skills model not meet these principles? Secondly, I suggest that you look throughout the Australian curriculum. This includes the Australian curriculum in general, the Australian curriculum English, and the Australian curriculum general capabilities, where literacy is included as a skill that should be taught across all subject areas. As you're using and reading through the Australian curriculum, take note of references to preparing students for the 21st century, life and work. And the purpose of doing this is that you're essentially getting additional evidence here that you could use in your essay to argue why a particular model reflects the overall objectives of the Australian curriculum and preparing children for the 21st century. Finally, I suggest you conduct a Google search using terms like 21st century literacy and 21st century literacy skills. And again, make notes of exactly what these sorts of skills are and how you could argue that a particular model, be it the skills model or any other model you'll learn about in upcoming weeks, best prepares children for these skills. The point I've suggested here is to search both texts and images, and the reason I suggest images is you'll find lots of graphics which provide excellent summaries of the different sorts of 21st century literacy skills that are there, and it's probably a bit of a time saver initially where you don't have to read through pages of text, and it's a simpler way to understand and springboard your research. And the final slide here is the success criteria. So going back to the learning intention that I set at the start of the lesson and said assessment for learning principles incorporates learning intentions and success criteria, these are the criteria I'd like you to reflect on to determine how well you've understood the information I've presented here. So do you understand the difference between theories and models? Do you know how this week's learning relates to the first assessment? Do you understand the difference between models of schooling and models of literacy development? Do you understand some of the broad reading skills that are taught by teachers and how these relate to bottom-up theory in the skills model? And have you considered the benefits and limitations of bottom-up theory in the skills model, including their relativity to 21st century literacy skills? Once you've reflected on this success criteria, if you're not clear on any of these points, I recommend you go back over the learning materials and the readings, and certainly use the discussion board to post questions that you may have for me and the rest of the group, so we can clarify any misunderstandings that you may have. Thanks everyone.